And I want to take as my text here a statement that Winston Churchill made in a speech in Parliament on August 16th, 1945. It was the Germans had surrendered about 3 months earlier, May 8th, 1945, and on August 15th, the Japanese emperor had announced the intention of the Japanese to surrender. The formal surrender happens about 2-3 weeks later famously on the deck of the battleship Missouri in Tokyo Harbor. But the emperor had announced on August 15th that formal surrender was just around the corner. So Churchill takes to the floor of Parliament. He's no longer prime minister, thanks to elections the preceding month. But he gave this speech in which he tried to sum up for his countrymen and anybody else that wanted to listen what were going to be the longer-term historical downstream consequences of this great conflict that had now come to an end. He said a lot of things in this speech. It's worth rereading. It's a relatively short speech. But there was one sentence in it that when I first read the transcript of the speech, it just leapt off the page at me, not least of all because he used a peculiar form of grammar that went out of fashion in American English in the middle of the 19th century, but has persisted in British English, at least down through Churchill's time. He rendered the United States as a plural noun in this sentence I'm going to quote to you. That's one thing that struck me. Another thing that struck me is it's a simple declarative sentence, which Churchill rather, didn't get off very often. He had the penchant for the Baroque, Rococo kind of speech. It was a simple, straightforward sentence rendered in a purely British idiom in which he said simply, this is August 1945 now, he said, the United States stand at this moment at the summit of the world. The United States stand at this moment at the summit of the world. Now, with the appropriate qualifications and modifications, I'd say that sentence could be said at almost any time between 1945 and 2012. That the United States, because of World War II, the United States became the principal, some say hegemonic power in the international order. And though it doesn't occupy that position quite so unambiguously as it did in 1945, something pretty close to that has remained the case ever since. So this is a major moment in not only in American history, but in world history. Okay. The premise of what I want to try to argue with you or present to you here this morning is that World War II was, go back to something I said to you yesterday morning, the Second World War was a transformative moment. It was one of these episodes where when we look back over the historical record, it's impossible not to recognize that the world before and after this chapter in human history are the world's two different places before and after. It's a truly transformative event. So that's the premise of these remarks, that the war is transformative. And there's a proposition that I want to argue here and hope I can convince you of it, and that is that in the American case, the case of the United States, the transformations that the war worked did not just happen. That they were the result of some very shrewdly taken, deeply considered, and well-executed policy decisions about how to fight a particular kind of war on a particular timetable, on a basis of a particular strategic doctrine, and with a very deliberately configured composition of forces. Okay, this is so that the changes we get out of the war, to repeat, flow from these decisions about how to fight the war in a particular way, in a particular calendar, particular force composition. And the transformations we see did not just happen as a result of these policies. Okay. I mentioned to you yesterday, I think, if I remember correctly, how Philip Roth in his novel American Pastoral has described the post-war era as the greatest moment of collective inebriation in all of American history. A time of enormous national self-congratulation, self-confidence, prosperity, shared prosperity, increasing participation of peoples and regions that had not been the mainstream of American life before, the South and the West in particular, beginning a boom phase that's lasted right down through into the early years of the present century. So there's a whole array of indexes, both domestic and international, that tell us just how transformative a moment we're in here. Now, just to get our heads around that a little bit, let's just imagine the following. Let's imagine you're walking down the streets of any great American city. Let's make it New Orleans, since here we are, in 1940. And you come across, as you probably would be likely to do in New Orleans, a street corner speaker. And he's up on his soapbox, and he's telling all who pass by and want to listen something like the following. My fellow Americans, in this year of grace 1940, I'm here to tell you that this Great Depression that has been settled on our land for the last 11 years, since 1929, an unemployment rate averaging 17% over the decade, never went below 14%. I'm here to tell you that that's going to end in just a few months from now. And we're going to enter on a period of prosperity in our nation's history, the likes of which we've never seen before. We will double the size of the middle class, measured by the index of home ownership, by the year 1960. And we will, in this moment, as I was saying to something yesterday, I'm breaking character here, we will, in this moment, finally grasp the nettle of the most vexed issue in our national life, the issue of racial equality, to be something called the civil rights movement, which is going to emerge, and will significantly change the status of our fellow black citizens. And what's more, he's going on, he's saying, and my fellow citizens, I'm also here to tell you that this isolationist country of ours, which refused to join the League of Nations in 1919, which erected first the Fordney-McCumber Tariff in 1922, and then the Smoot-Hawley Tariff in 1930, the most restrictive trade barriers in this country's history, which insisted on the repayment of the World War I era debts from France and Britain to the United States, which has disrupted capital flows and international investment patterns for the last 2 decades, and which the Congress of which in our country enacted no fewer than 5 formal neutrality statutes between 1935 and 1939, binding the hands of our executive, our president, from taking a role in this great international conflict, which is now, incidentally, a year old in Europe and 3 years old in Asia by the time I'm speaking now, 1940. And what's more, you might add, in 1924, let me remind you, my fellow citizens, that this country also passed the most restrictive immigration legislation in its history, which has made it virtually impossible for us to bring political and religious ethnic refugees, notably persecuted Jews in Europe, into our country, seeking political refuge from Nazi persecution. But I'm here to tell you, it goes on, that 5 years from now, just 5 years over the horizon of the future, this isolationist country of ours will emerge as the chief funder and founder of a successor body to the League of Nations. It'll be called the United Nations. And we're not going to see it installed over there in that striped pants European capital in Geneva. We're going to put it in our principal city of New York. We're going to embrace this thing wholeheartedly. And what's more, we're going to take the lead in creating a whole array of new international institutions in which we will provide most of the funding and to which we'll provide most of the leadership and inspiration. One will be called the International Monetary Fund. One will be called the World Bank. Another will be called the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which will later in this century morph into something called the World Trade Organization, or WTO. And the net effect of all of these institutions that we are going to build will so transform the international order that by the end of this current century, ladies and gentlemen, we will have to invent a new word to describe what's happened, and the word will be globalization. Now, anybody who made that speech in the streets of New Orleans or any other American city in 1940 would have been immediately understood to be a lunatic and would have probably been hauled off and put in some padded cell someplace and never heard from again, because there was absolutely no credible evidence that underlay those kinds of assertions in 1940. Okay? We know how the story develops. We know that this apparently crazy speaker out there actually had it absolutely right. That by 1945, this country has transformed its internal characteristics in significant ways and has utterly transformed not only its relationship to the international order, but the character of that international system itself. And that's the world we've lived in essentially ever since, particularly internationally. We still live in an American-made system that was put together in the